Hello, hi. I think we're live now, and welcome to the REF 2029 Town Hall on the guidance for volume measure and codes of practice. The talk's going to be recorded and published on ref.ac.uk. The Q&A will open later in the chat, so we've been working to get through the questions we received in advance in the slides, so we'll try and preempt some of your questions with that. We'll only really answer questions on today's topics. So I know there'll be lots of surrounding questions, but we're going to keep it quite tightly focused. And we just also want to flag that there is a PCE webinar on the 12th of February between 1 and 2 p.m. for people who do have burning questions about PCE, and we know that there will be. Okay. So, just to introduce ourselves, I'm Jonathan Petrovsky, and I'm the head of REF Policy. And Rebecca, do you want to introduce yourself?
Morning, my name is Rebecca Emis. I'm a Senior Policy and Engagement Advisor in the REF team.
Super. Yeah, and it's great to be here and speaking to all of you today. So this is probably information that most people know, but I think when we speak about the REF, it's always important to put the exercise in context. We want to take a minute just to sort of highlight that REF is a UK-wide initiative that's owned and led by the 4 UK funding bodies. It informs the allocation of around £2 billion of block grant funding each year. It provides accountability for that public investment in research. And it continually evolves. The previous REFs have built on each other, and we're doing so again in REF 2029, and that kind of mirrors the research base. And given the connection to allocation of funds, it inevitably drives behaviour, and therefore it's a significant policy instrument across the UK. I mean, we've just spoken about the purposes of the REF, but in developing the exercise, the funding bodies had a vision for the sector, and that was a research system that produces high quality, rigorous research that's open to all, an inclusive and collaborative research system that supports the diversity of people, ideas, institutions, methodologies, outputs and activities, and an engaged and impactful research system that connects research with the wider society to bring about positive socio-economic change. And 3 priorities were also developed for the exercise, and they were developed through consultation with the sector. And we use those priorities to drive our decision making. And in my mind, those priorities form a triangle of factors which often need to be sort of weighed and balanced against each other. And they are a robustness of assessment outcomes. We need to have confidence in the outcomes of the REF, the impact of the system on research culture, and ensuring that the bureaucratic burden of the system is proportionate, and quite often that they can interact with each other and need to work to balance with each other. And over to you, Rebecca.
Thanks, Jonathan. So this presentation is based on the guidance that was published on the 16th of January 2025, and it's aiming to provide you with a comprehensive understanding of the requirements and the principles of the volume measure for REF 2029, and then we'll come on later on to talk about the related code of practice guidance later on in the presentation. Thank you. So the first major question that we should start with is what the volume measure is for. So the volume measure ensures that the scale of an HEI's higher education institution submission is proportionate to its research capacity. It is allowing us to calculate how many outputs and impact case studies that ought to be submitted for each UOA, and ensuring that that is proportionate to the research capacity. It's also providing important information on the size and shape of the sector, and it gives us that proxy for research capacity. The funding bodies may also use the volume measure to inform the allocation of block funding. What it doesn't do is determine which outputs are eligible for submission by a UOA. So outputs are not tied to the volume measure, encouraging the submission of a wider range of outputs, which is a contrast with previous exercises. So, next slide, please, Jonathan. So, to summarise, there are a number of key changes for REF 2029 in relation to the volume measure. So the first and probably most obvious one is that the volume measure is going to be gathered directly from the Higher Education Statistics Agency, HESA, staff record, rather than through a REF census. This goes alongside with the breaking of the link between individuals and REF submissions. So there's a greater focus on the assessment of disciplinary areas and teams rather than individuals. It's important to note that the inclusion of a specific contract in the calculation, so that's information that's drawn from the HESA staff record, does not dictate whether an output or impact case study can be included in the submission or which unit of assessment it should be assigned to. And full details on what can be and should be included in submissions will be published as part of the Contributions to Knowledge and Understanding module in Spring/Summer 2025. Another key change for REF 2029 is that individual staff circumstances are no longer a feature, which we hope will reduce the burden of the exercise for HEIs. Thanks, Jonathan. So everybody's favourite technical detail. So there are three major HESA fields that are used to calculate the volume measure for REF 2029. The first is contract con FTE. This represents the percentage of a full-time equivalent year worked by a staff member on a specific contract. The second is contract ref qualcon, which is a flag which is attached to a contract to identify that that contract is contributing to the REF 2029 volume measure. And finally, contract ref UOA 2029, which identifies the UOA associated with a contract that contributes to the volume measure or is eligible to contribute to the volume measure. And I've just got a little note here, which I'll talk a bit more about in a minute, that for REF 2029, contracts that are lower than 0.2 con FTE will be included in the volume measure if they meet the other criteria to make them volume contributing. Thanks, Jonathan. Have the next slide, please. So, more technical detail, we can get down into the weeds of this one. So when you are looking to when we are looking to calculate the submission size, this will be done through the following steps. So firstly, the con FTE of volume contributing contracts will be totaled, and they will be averaged across the 2 years of the HESA staff record that are included. So for this REF, that will be 2025-26 and 2026-27. And just to flag again, that will include contracts that are smaller than a 0.2 con FTE. In future, CKU guidance will provide more detail on the definition of demonstrable and substantive link, which is often tied or has previously been tied to the size of that contract. So once we have that total con FTE and that average across those 2 years, the average will be divided by 100. So for example, con FTE of 250 will be expressed as 2.5 at UOA level. And then we will times that by 2.5, which will then give us the number of outputs, which will then be rounded to the nearest whole number. So there are a number of worked examples for you there on the screen. So for example, a UOA with a volume measure of 10 will have that timed by 2.5 and have a nice easy 25 outputs to submit. A UOA with a volume measure of 7.3 would have a submission requirement of 18. So that would be that 7.3 by 2.5, which will give us an 18.25. And when rounded to the nearest whole number, that's rounded down, giving you an output, a number of 18. And that final example there, where the volume measure is 5, the submission requirement would be 13, because that would be 5 by 2.5, which gives us a 12.5. And when it's a 5, it rounds up to the next number, so the nearest whole number will be 13. So the volume measure will also be used to calculate the number of impact case studies required, and we will publish more information on this as part of the engagement and impact policy module later in the year. Now, we have had a few questions relating to whether it's possible to split an eligible contract, so only the proportion of the contract relating to research is included in the volume measure. And we can confirm that there's no change from REF 2021 on this, and that the full CON-FTE from volume contributing contracts will be used in the volume calculation, regardless of the proportion of it that is allocated to research activity. This will also be the case where a contract becomes eligible for the REF Qualcomm flag during the course of the year. So, for example, if research independence is established partway through a HESA reporting year. Now, we appreciate that this is less precise. However, the volume measure is a proxy for research capacity rather than an exact measure of research capacity. Therefore, there will be circumstances which are not perfectly represented within the calculation. And we did discuss this topic extensively during policy development with the sector representatives, and we sought to balance the burden of the work involved in getting very precise data with whether that was proportionate burden. And the conclusion was that on balance, the administrative burden to achieve that level of precision was not proportionate. And there will be some areas where this means that the volume measure is inflated, others where it's slightly deflated across the total CON-FTE. And on balance, and as inclusion in the volume measure is not required to establish output eligibility, this approach provides sufficiently robust proxy for research capacity whilst also maintaining proportionate burden. So next slide, please, Jonathan. So in terms of the contracts that are included in the volume measure, the contracts captured within the volume measure are held by the same group of staff that were previously recorded as category A in a REF staff census. So there's no change on the communities whose contracts we're looking to capture. So the contracts that will be included in the volume measure are contracts in the HESA staff record that are flagged as AC EMP Fund 3, teaching and research, or AC EMP Fund 2, research only, in the AC EMP Fund field, which is a fun word to say. I encourage you all to do so. Contracts will also require the staff member to be on the payroll during the academic year 25-26 or 26-27 and returned to that HESA staff record. Contracts that meet the definition of significant responsibility for research or research independence and are marked with the REF Qualcomm flag will be marked with the REF Qualcomm flag in the HESA staff record. It should be noted that teaching only, so that's AC EMP Fund 1, contracts cannot be included in the volume measure calculation. And along with this, the data that we'll draw from the HESA staff record, all HEIs are required to have an approved code of practice to identify contracts with significant responsibility for research or research independence. We have had some queries in advance of the session as to why teaching only contracts are omitted from the volume measure. And as the volume measure is a proxy for research capacity, it therefore captures information about contracts with research components, so teaching and research only contracts. And we encourage all HEIs to accurately reflect the primary employment function of their staff in the HESA staff record. We've also had questions regarding variety of different communities within the research and academic community, such as doctoral students, honorary contracts, and outputs co-authored by teaching staff, and emeritus staff as well. And we recognise that these are really important questions for the sector. Now, due to the decoupling of the framework for REF 2029, staff are not submitted to the REF. So HEIs will be able to submit any output to which they can demonstrate a substantive link. And full details on the definition of a substantive and demonstrable link are going to be published as part of the CKU, as Contributions to Knowledge and Understanding policy module, which is currently being co-developed with the sector. And outlined in the initial decision's next step in December 23, and informed by the consultation responses to the initial decisions, we can confirm now that outputs which are sole authored by postgraduate research students, including PhD theses, will not be eligible for submission. Thank you, Jonathan.
Okay, back over to me then.
Yeah.
Super. So the codes of practice are mentioned in the volume measure module, and obviously we're going to go into that into more detail later in this session. They have a key role in the identification of contracts to be included in the volume measure. And the codes of practice are written by participating institutions, and they're documents really for them and their staff. And they ensure that the key decisions made about REF submissions are transparent, that they're robust, and that they're equitable. And we'll get more into that later. The volume measure guidance refers to the codes of practice, and they are interlinked and operate together. The institutional codes of practice are a requirement for REF 2029. They embed a framework of principles for the key decisions that HEIs must develop to shape the REF 2029 submissions. And HEIs wishing to submit to the exercise must have an approved code of practice that is applied to the identification of contracts with SRR and research independence. I guess we've tried not to be too prescriptive in the way that the codes of practice operate, and allowing HIs to build this into their business as usual, potentially as part of workload planning and objective setting. I guess we view the notions of SRR and research independence as related to people and to their careers, and as such there are requirements around equality impact assessments, and the communication of decisions and opportunity for appeal. So delving more into the identification of SRR, the general approach and definitions around this have been retained from REF 2021. As Rebecca said, it's the same population that we're seeking to identify as with the last exercise. The criteria for identifying SRR must be objective, so based on clear, measurable factors, not subjective opinions. They must be inclusive and non-discriminatory, so they must be applied fairly, consistently, without bias, and they must promote inclusion in the HEI's research community. And they must be transparent, so they must be clearly communicated and accessible to all staff. So the process of identifying contracts with SRR, so all eligible teaching and research contracts with SRR should be included in the REF 2029 volume measure. And where all eligible teaching and research contracts have SRR, so they precisely, I suppose the HESA Academic Fund 3 precisely identifies the volume contributing contracts, that can simply be stated in the code of practice with no further information required for that section. But we do know in a reasonable proportion of code of practice, or at least for the last exercise, that teaching and research contracts did not precisely identify all of the contracts with SRR. And when that is the case, submitting HEIs must develop process, procedures and criteria for the identification of significant responsibility for research. It must be developed in consultation with staff and their representatives and documented in the institution's code of practice. And they should then be marked as Ref Qualcon in the HESA staff record. So this is the significant responsibility definition. It is the same as REF 2021. Contracts with significant responsibility for research are those for whom explicit time and resources are made available to engage actively in independent research, and that is an expectation of their job role. So the indicators provided here are examples to guide HEIs in developing their own processes for identifying staff with significant responsibility for research. Meeting all indicators is not mandatory, and HEIs have flexibility in setting their own criteria and documenting this in their code of practice. However, criteria and process that routinely exclude staff who meet most of these indicators would likely be deemed inappropriate. The submission approach may vary by UOA, where employment practices vary at that level. And it's expected that those variations will be based on disciplinary norms. So, for example, working with industry or NHS staff or creative industry, rather than purely local differences in practice, and be documented in the code of practice. So moving on to identifying contracts with significant responsibility for research. So all codes of practice must outline policies and procedures for identifying whether research-only contracts demonstrate research independence. Research independence is when staff members undertake self-directed research rather than primarily carrying out another individual's research programme. An example of indicators are provided in the policy. Just to touch on research assistants. So research assistants are primarily employed to support another individual's research rather than pursuing independent research. But we know that's not always the case. And therefore, there are, in exceptional cases, the contracts of research assistants who meet the definition of an independent researcher and are on the submitting institution's payroll with a research-only contract can be included. And as with the rest of included contracts, they should be flagged with as Ref Qualcomm in the HESA staff record. I would flag that being named on research outputs alone does not necessarily qualify a contract for inclusion. Okay, so moving on to indicators of research independence. As I said, their example indicators are provided in the policy, and HEIs have flexibility in setting their own criteria and documenting this in the code of practice. However, criteria and a process that routinely exclude staff who meet most of these indicators would likely to be considered inappropriate. Research independence should be considered persistent, and we know that research independence might vary across units of assessment due to disciplinary or employment practices. And we've had a question regarding the list of independent research fellowships mentioned in the policy. I appreciate it's an important question, and we're looking to update and publish this as soon as possible with advice from the REF panels. And obviously we're conscious that a swift update is needed as HEIs prepare the HESA returns. And I think it's over to you now, Rebecca.
Thanks, Jonathan. So all eligible contracts will be mapped against UOAs, and so signed a UOA using the REF 29 UOA flag in HESA. And HEIs will be responsible for mapping that ConFTE to UOAs. So each eligible contract, and that's all eligible contracts, should be mapped against a UOA. So that is not just the contracts that are have been marked as Ref Qualcomm, so as contributing to the volume measure, but all contracts that qualify as eligible contracts. So that's all ACEMP Fund 2 and 3. So all teaching and research contracts should have a UOA assigned. Now, where staff have multiple contracts, so an individual holds more than one, each contract may be returned to a different UOA as the HEI deems appropriate. And also, we appreciate that there may be some annual variation in some cases between the UOA allocation, reflecting the evolving nature of research and substantive connections. Should note here as well that the REF team, we're working with HESA to explore whether a process for amendments can be developed for the 25-26 year, should additional amendments need to be made to the staff record return, and we will publish more information on that in the future. Just to note as well, with HESA cost centres, while they're often related, HESA cost centres and UOAs are not the same. And as long as the allocation of contracts to a UOA is logical and a rationale can be provided for the approach taken, it is perfectly acceptable for HESA cost centres and UOAs not to align exactly. And we leave it to the discretion of HEIs to make that allocation to UOA. I should also flag here audit, which is section 14 in the guidance. HEIs may be requested by audit to provide reasonable rationale for their decisions. Equality considerations may also be requested as part of this to ensure that UOA allocations are fair and inclusive, and full details on audit and information for small unit exceptions will follow in the future. We have had a couple of questions regarding situations where there might be a change in the volume measure, specifically if it were to decrease and therefore outputs might need to be removed from a submission. And we are conscious of the importance of this to the sector, and it will be part of the full audit guidance for REF 2029, which is currently to be developed. And so it'll be updated within section 14, which you can see in the policy is marked for update in the future. Thanks, Jonathan. So there are a series of variations within the guidance on how ConFTE should be returned in the HESA staff record, and you can see them listed there. So it ranges from sabbaticals and pension staff to staff on hourly or daily pay, or staff working multiple contracts. In the cases of sabbaticals and staff on secondment, there will be additional information on how that might be recorded in the future once the ongoing HESA's staff record consultation has been completed. That's due to be completed by the end of April, I believe. This update is intended to capture nuance and to support the accuracy in determining the volume measure as a proxy for research. Thanks, Jonathan. So moving on now to look a little bit more closely at the codes of practice guidance. So this is intended to give you a comprehensive understanding of the requirements and principles of codes of practices for REF 2029. So if we start with an overview of what a code of practice or a COP is, for REF 2029, having an approved code of practice is a mandatory requirement for all higher education institutions wishing to participate. And the code of practice will set a minimum standard for participation. So it's ensuring that all submissions meet certain criteria and guidelines. And it is essential that all the codes of practice are approved by the funding bodies to ensure compliance and standardization across the sector. So the codes of practice go beyond procedural and legislative compliance and aim to embed a framework of principles throughout the key decisions made by HEIs that shape their REF 29 submissions. They're built on three core principles. First being robustness. This principle ensures that submissions are an accurate reflection of the sector, which then supports confidence in the outcomes of the REF and related funding decisions. Transparency. So it's crucial that decision-making processes are clear and understandable, and transparent processes help reassure the sector that the same rules are being followed everywhere and by everyone. And equity and inclusion. So decisions about submissions should be fair and impartial, supporting a diversity of people and research. And codes of practice promote inclusive research environments where diverse contributions are valued and supported. So the guidance for the codes of practice is going to be published in two main modules. The first, which was published in January, the volume measure guidance, and that provides guidance on identifying contracts with significant responsibility for research and for determining research independence. And then in the spring-summer 25, we will be publishing the output selection module, which will provide guidance on the selection of research outputs for submission to the REF. So while the policy modules are going to be published separately, HEIs only need to submit their codes of practice once as a complete document for approval by the UK funding bodies. And there are 4 submission windows that are outlined in the policy that are open for about 5 days each. The first window closing in August, the second in October, the third in December, and the final one in February 2026. And the intention is that approvals will be made within a maximum timeline of 3 months, depending on the speeds of response by an HEI to feedback from the funding bodies. So the primary responsibility for the approvals process sits with the funding bodies, but there will be input from PDAP and RDAP. So that is the People and Diversity Advisory Panel and the Research Diversity Advisory Panel. And we've had some questions about the proximity of the first submission window to the publication of the CKU policy module. And we are aware that the publication of the CKU policy is key for the preparation of codes of practice. And we are working at pace to develop this with the sector and aim to publish it as soon as possible. And we recognise that this does pose potentially a challenge when it comes to drafting codes of practice, and therefore we have tried to build as much flexibility into the process as possible by offering these 4 different submission windows to allow for different internal processes and the different needs of institutions across the sector. We're also working collaboratively with HESA, as mentioned before, on developing and working on different elements of the HESA staff record as appropriate. Over to you, Jonathan.
Thank you. And I think it's kind of worth talking about the codes of practice in the policy context, and as it has determined our approach, and I think links to the longer term ambition. So I think particularly thinking about the move to calculate the volume measure from data held in the HESA staff record, and then the longer term aim to move to continuous data collection over a REF cycle. And in doing so, staff lists are no longer submitted, and that breaks that link between submitted individual staff members and submitted outputs. And I think the REF 2029 codes of practice reflect those changes in its requirements through an attempt to have a greater reliance on existing HEI governance and processes to make key decisions for REF 2029, and thereby trying to minimise additional requirements and administrative burden created by the REF. Having equality impact assessments that consider definitions of significant responsibility for research and research independence, and the selection of outputs, and the removal of the processes around individual staff circumstances. And I think that the move to continuous volume calculation will change the nature of REF codes of practice going forward, which will become living documents, and more information about future maintenance and approval of codes of practice will be published in due course. And I guess I see the REF 2029 as the exercise that implements some of these longer term changes and is transitionary. I think that the challenge for future exercises is how we embed these changes further into business as usual for institutions. So I thought I'd just pay a quick mention to codes of practice and PCE, as it's a popular topic. And I think just to say that they are distinct but complementary elements of the exercise. The codes of practice are intended to set a minimum standard for participation and ensuring compliance and standardization. And the PCE assessment aims to promote excellence beyond those minimum standards, focusing on a much wider range of indicators and subject matter to foster positive and inclusive research cultures. I thought I'd also talk a little bit about the codes of practice implementation. I know Rebecca's kind of touched on this a little bit, but we do recognise, the time pressures that institutions are under in relation to the HESA submission deadlines, and I guess some of the measures we've taken are to address that potential misalignment between early implementation and final codes of practice approval. We've put in an extended submission window, so with multiple deadlines to accommodate diverse needs around that. We're working with HESA, who've been fantastic to work with, continuing to collaborate to try and explore whether amendments to REF-related fields in the HESA staff record is possible for the 25-26 data collection period. We're trying to think about proportionate approvals, and I think more guidance on this is probably needed, but approval outcomes will consider the burden on HEIs, potential impact on individuals, and the scale of impact on submissions. And also the funding bodies will provide further guidance on expectations before formal submission. And I think that probably will be more about the practical elements of codes of practice approval. Okay, as per the last exercise, there'll be a codes of practice complaints and investigation process. The funding bodies will establish a formal complaints process for individuals who believe that an institution has not followed its approved code of practice. And this process will allow individuals to raise concerns to the funding bodies and seek corrective actions if their complaints are upheld. But it's important to note that the complaints can't challenge the adequacy of an approved code of practice itself, but address issues of non-compliance with the code of practice. Okay, so this slide focuses on code of practice for the volume measure. We've already kind of discussed the guideline. The guidance outlines two key tests for determining whether a contract is eligible for inclusion, that of SRR and that of research independence. And contracts that meet either of those tests should be included in the volume measure, as we've already covered. I'm just going to hand over to you now, Rebecca.
Thanks, Jonathan. So in terms of the codes of practice structure, for REF 2029, we're expecting this to include several key sections. Firstly, the introduction, and this section should discuss the codes of practice in the context of the principles of robustness, transparency, equity and inclusion. Then a section on policies and procedures. So this section should outline the policies and procedures for identifying SRR and research independence. And then we have the section on staff committees and training. And this section should detail the roles and responsibilities of staff and committees involved in codes of practice processes, as well as training on equality, diversity and inclusion. And then the Equality Impact Assessment, or EIAs. And this section should describe the mandatory EIAs and their analysis and actions. We have had a number of questions about the expected or ideal length of a code of practice. We encourage you to look at and consider the template, but fill it out into a manner that is appropriate to you, and to consider accessibility and succinctness as you do so. Given the varied needs of the sector, we also acknowledge that there's not a single right way to write a code of practice. If you would like to consult EDAP's report on the REF 2021 codes of practice, this does provide some useful information and suggestions for how best to approach them effectively. So we'd recommend that. Thank you. So the policies and procedures section of the codes of practice should include, as Jonathan mentioned, information around identifying significant responsibility for research. So this involves outlining the criteria and processes for identifying staff with SRR responsibilities, and identifying research independence. So this involves outlining the criteria and processes for determining research independence, and also consultation with staff. It is important to consult with staff using appropriate representation mechanisms within the HEI to ensure that the processes are fair and transparent. And we did have a question in advance of the session about whether or not these processes used for consultation need to be detailed extensively within the code of practice, or whether it can just be stated that consultation has taken place. The requirement we have is that staff are consulted, and we feel that HEIs are best placed to decide that process that best meets their needs, and we expect that you will acknowledge and confirm that you have consulted in whichever manner is appropriate for you within your code of practice. Thank you. So staff committees and training. So this section details the roles and responsibilities of staff and committees involved in codes of practice processes. So it should include roles and responsibilities, clearly defining whether roles are advisory or decision making, and information on training on equality, diversity and inclusion. So this will include information around ensuring that all staff involved in code of practice processes have received training on EDI, ideally tailored for REF processes. And we have had a question about the guidance on this, that to clarify what we are expecting to see within the code of practice. And what we're asking for is assurance that relevant training has been delivered and information on the content of that training, but we don't need you to tell us exactly how you delivered the trainings. So hopefully that answers that question. If not, please do follow up with us in the Q&A. Over to you, Jonathan.
Super. And just focusing in a little bit on the equality impact assessments. They are a requirement, a mandatory component of codes of practice for REF 2029, assessing policies and practices for identifying significant responsibility for research and research independence. Should include analysis and actions, and the EIA should inform the code of practice. We would also expect that the final EIAs will be published. And I guess we've received some questions about EIAs in the context of contracts contributing to the volume measure. And I suppose just to reflect on that, I guess we view the notions of SRR and research independence as related to people and their careers. Quite often they'll tie into workload allocation, and the criteria used can have an impact upon people. So while we don't want to be the inclusion of contracts in the volume measure to be directly impactful on people's careers, we believe that the underlying criteria can be. And I guess on balance, and we did debate about the right level of requirements around this, this is the sort of the course we've taken through. The requirements in the codes of practice around feedback and appeals. Institutions should provide sufficient opportunity for staff to appeal decisions about SRR and research independence, and that's the same as in REF 2021. The appeal mechanisms should be independent of the original decisions and made clearly available to staff in a timely fashion. I think that's general good practice in appeals. It may tie into existing mechanisms, so I'm sure many institutions will have decision-making functions which have appeals, and obviously would welcome institutions that take the opportunity to kind of embed this in their existing practices rather than creating additional ref processes. Just to touch on joint submissions, so we haven't published our policy around joint submissions yet, but perhaps this is a bit of a spoiler that there is one coming. So for institutions making joint submissions, collaborating institutions may share parts of their codes of practice across the joint submission if they wish to. Joint decision making must not compromise adherence to each other's codes of practice. And a shared approach. So collaborating institutions can agree on a shared approach with one code of practice approved and used on behalf of the other for managing the joint submitting unit, if that works. So there's a few options there, and I think it is basically finding the right one that meets the kind of the way that the joint submission is functions, and we're quite open to different flexible approaches there. So just looking forward, I think we kind of indicate that codes of practice will be updated, and I guess that move to codes of practice as a living document and continuous sort of volume measure collection across the ref period from HESA. We think that there's probably a need for more information about what that needs to look like, and what approvals will look like in that context, and we'll work to publish more about that later in the ref cycle, and that will include details on how they should be updated and maintained to ensure ongoing compliance and relevance. But I do think there's a case for us to kind of really think about the function of codes of practice in future context. Super. So we've reached the end of our slides. We did take 40 minutes, which is pretty much exactly what we had hoped we would do. So I'm quite pleased with that. Thank you for attending. Stay in touch, get updates. You can use the QR code here to sign up for ref updates straight to your inbox, and you'll get notifications of when new information is published and activity that's taking place. You can visit the Get Involved page on our website to view current opportunities, including tomorrow's PCE webinar. You can email us at info@ref.ac.uk, where we have a managed inbox, and you can, if you want to make any suggestions about how we can improve our guidance for you. So shall I stop sharing the slides? Is that a good thing to do? I think so. And I think we're going to move to the questions portion of the town hall, and thankfully you've been sending them in. I haven't had a chance to look at them yet, but I will do that. Sylvie, are you going to read some questions out for us? Sylvie, you can't see, but you'll hear her voice.
Yeah, great, thank you. So the first one is just on the point about EDI training. Are you asking that EDI training for people involved in decision making happens before the code of practice is submitted?
I don't think we've provided specific detail on that in the policy, but I think it would need to be in place for the decision making, in my perspective. I don't know, Rebecca, if you have any thing to add to that.
Sorry, pause to unmute. No, I don't have anything to add for that. I think that covers it.
Thank you. Okay, so the next question is about appeals processes. So why is an appeals process needed for research independence? Unlike in Ref 21, it no longer determines Ref eligible outputs, which is the key concern for researchers, and a HESA independence flag, which is never published at the person level, has no possible detriment to them. This adds unnecessary complexity and will be a huge burden.
So I can pick this one up. I think, as Jonathan outlined in his portion of the discussion there, that research independence being something that is persistent and is to do with a person, we would expect that would have to be to do with their career and their progression through their career. And we would want people to be able to have confidence in that process and have therefore a mechanism for appealing if they felt that it was incorrect. Jonathan, is there anything you'd like to add on that?
No, I think that's exactly what I would say. We have talked about it, and we do see a link to careers and to individuals. Super.
Great, thank you. Okay, so the next one is, will you want HEIs to indicate which of the 4 code of practice submission windows they're aiming for?
We haven't asked for that, but it does sound like a good thing to know. We will produce more guidance on this, and working with the funding bodies to do that. It might be that sort of an ask for intentions might be a useful way of us managing the task of assessing and approving hundreds of codes of practice. So I think that sounds like a very positive solution that we'll consider.
Thank you. So next one, what equality, what equality impact should we consider in UOA allocation? Section 13 of volume measure guidance. Previously, discipline alignment was straightforward, e.g. historians go to history. What additional factors do we now need to consider?
It's a really, really good question. And I think it's worth acknowledging that in some disciplines, this will continue to be very straightforward. HEIs will be in a position to allocate staff contracts to UOAs without any question. But for some disciplines, there will be greater diversity and choice as to where a contract is allocated. Without requiring consideration through an EIA, there is a risk that biases in how an institution might map staff to UOAs could disproportionately affect groups, women, minority ethnic staff, and those with non-traditional career paths. So this could inadvertently disadvantage certain staff groups, particularly part-time workers, women, disabled staff, and early career researchers, who might be more likely to face structural barriers or be concentrated in roles where their contributions might not be fully captured. And so we are advising that these things are considered when HEIs are allocating contracts to UOAs.
Thank you. Next one is, can you please explain how the averaging of Con FTE over 2 years works? Is it just simply Con FTE for the first year plus Con FTE for the second year divided by 2, or is it more complicated than that?
Oh, that's it. Yeah, nothing to add on that. Absolutely best possible description of it, I'd say. Yeah.
All right, thank you. Okay. The next one is, do I understand correctly that teaching only FTE does not contribute to the volume measure, but outputs by teaching only staff can be submitted provided that there is a substantive connection to the HEI?
No, that is slightly incorrect. As published in the initial decisions and the update to initial decisions in December, outputs solely authored by teaching only staff are excluded. But I would say that the full policy for CKUs, the contributions to knowledge and understanding, is being actively developed at the moment and will be published soon. And I would recommend reading the full policy on that when it is published. But you are correct that teaching only FTE will not contribute to the volume measure.
The next one is, what is the rationale for requiring a UOA for all ACEM Fund 2 and 3, not just those included in the volume measure? That doesn't seem proportionate burden-wise.
That's an interesting point. I'm glad I get to say ACEM Fund. So that's good. I guess it does tell us about the proportions of staff that with different contract types that contribute to the volume measure, or that have significant responsibility for research and research independence. And I think that in itself is an interesting kind of measure and provides sort of an interesting perspective on on UOAs and disciplines. I think in particular, thinking about future exercises, the knowledge and understanding about the composition of different UOAs would be really interesting, and can be used to help us think about what UOAs might look like in the future. I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Rebecca.
No, I don't think I do.
Okay, thank you. So the next one is, in Ref 21, we made multiple submissions to UOA. There's no mention of this in the guidance. Will we be able to make multiple submissions to a single UOA in Ref 29?
So I would.
Sorry, Rebecca.
No, I mean, I was just going to say it'll be part of the CKU policy that will be published in spring, summer, but it might be something else you want to add there. So I will leave it to you.
I mean, no, thank you. That's great. Yes, it will be. We'll be publishing more information about that in the future. I guess I suppose with the flexibility of UOA allocation for this exercise, and sort of the decoupling from individuals. I guess it'd be quite interesting to see, if institutions still want to make multiple submissions. I think that. But there's more. Yeah, basically we have more work to do to really sort of think that through and provide the guidance on it.
Thank you. And do we need to allocate all research-only staff to UOA, even where they are ineligible due to non-independence?
All right, to take this one. Yes, is the short answer. The contract is eligible because it is a research-only contract. It will be marked as ref. It won't be marked as ref Qualcomm because it does not have research independence, but it should have a UOA. Yes.
Thank you. So the next one is, will HEIs have flexibility to swap allocated unit of assessment for individual SIG-RES flags up till the submission deadline?
I think that's something we're working on. I think it probably is important to allow a good degree of flexibility in this exercise. We've got to work with HESA to develop, how we might do that. So I don't want to overcommit, but I think we recognise in this sort of implementation of this new approach that it is the flexibility is an important key, important part of that. Yeah.
Thank you. Can we submit outputs from teaching staff as long as they have a substantive connection with the UOA?
So this is also a question for the CKU policy module, but I would point you back to the update to the initial decisions, which said that outputs from teaching staff that were solely authored by teaching staff would be excluded. Full details will be within the CKU policy.
Thank you. Is the code of practice template optional? It's very restrictive. Our interim code of practice, already agreed with trade unions, used in the annual REF processes, is more extensive than just staff and output selection, including mandatory EDI training, reviewer calibration, feedback mechanisms, fairness in assessment plans, and lots of other parts. I won't read them all out, but yeah, I'm just wondering about the flexibility of using the code of practice template.
Thank you. First of all, that sounds absolutely fantastic, and well done to whoever submitted that question. I guess we had intended that we would try and keep them uniform by using the template. And did we touch on this in the slides themselves, Rebecca?
Very briefly, yes, we recommended reference. Well, we asked for reference to the template, but also acknowledged that different HEIs will have different needs and will choose to fill it out differently, depending on the content that they feel is most appropriate.
I mean, obviously, with this particular case described, it does feel a little bit sort of as though that doesn't work very well with the approach taken by that institution. So maybe I think as it stands, we say they must use the template in the guidance. So I think it is sort of required in the existing guidance. But I think that yes, we should provide more information in the guidance around this that will be coming up, particularly around approvals a bit further down the line, perhaps.
Thank you. Are SRR and RI going to be fields in the HESA return, or is the assumption going to be that we'll be assigning these outside of the HESA staff data?
So at the moment, there is obviously SIGRES in the HESA data collection, and there's also a RESAS, so research assistance. There isn't a flag for research independence in the current data collection. We will be looking not at SIGRES, not at RESAS, but as Ref Qualcomm. So that's why we're asking you to tick that box if you feel that, or you've gone through your processes to ensure that a contract either is SRR or has research independence. We are not the only people who use the HESA data. Other people use the SIGRES fields and the RESAS fields, so they will continue to be collected. We will be looking at Ref Qualcomm. So I hope that answers your question. Please do follow it up in the Q&A box if it doesn't.
Thank you. If we have a robust process for classifying independent researcher by the contract they hold, do we need an appeals process?
Thank you. Yeah, and yes, as in the guidance, that is the case, and that's retaining the process from Ref 2021 and that same requirement. I think we spoke a little bit earlier about the kind of the perspective that independent researcher is linked to people's careers, and therefore building in that sort of communication and opportunity for appeal is important in that respect.
Thank you. So the next one is, after having mapped staff to UOA, does it then mean that we will need to make a submission in that UOA, or could we decide not to submit in that UOA and submit outputs to another UOA?
I think that ties back to the question that Jonathan answered a few moments ago about wanting to build some flexibility into that for the sector, because we know that things change between data submission and preparing a submission. So we are actively looking at that, and we are anticipating flexibility, though obviously we're also working with HESA on that, and will they're very, very supportive, but we will require collaboration with them to finalise information about that. But it is a very good question. Is there anything you want to add there, Jonathan?
No, I think that's covered it for me.
You've got a question about equality impact assessments. Can you please expand on the requirements for these, and what sorts of questions would they answer in this context?
Thank you. How to expand? I mean, first of all, I do wonder whether we are debating whether more guidance perhaps is needed around this, because we've had quite a few questions. But I suppose if I was to think of a sort of an example that came to mind, say if you had a criteria which linked to a certain amount of time being made available for research activities, and that amount of time was more likely, or some groups were less likely to have that amount of time made available due to part-time contract status, for example. So you might find that some protected characteristics are more likely to have part-time contracts. Then that would be an example of a type of, I guess, the criteria used for SRR and research independence that may have a potential equality impact, and that may differ across disciplines. So I guess that's the kind of thing that I see, and I suppose it's quite similar to Ref 2021 in that respect, even though they're not people being returned to submitted to the exercise, though we see that the impacts stand independently with the sort of status of significant responsibility for research and research independence. But I do wonder that whether perhaps we do need to issue some more guidance on this. So we'll take that note to think about.
We'll just add one last question because we're nearly at time, but there's been a few around what exactly we mean by persistence for research independence. Would you be able to talk on that for a moment?
Yeah, I can pick it up. Just looking at the question that's in the chat around if it being persistent, if someone's previously been identified as an independent researcher under the last ref, would we expect them to still be categorised as an independent researcher for ref 2029? I think it's important to note that anybody who's classified as research independent under the last ref was classified in that way using a code of practice that is no longer active. So we would still expect them to be considered under the new code of practice for Ref 2029 for that to be identified, that research independence to be identified. Obviously, going forward with codes of practice being living documents and persistent beyond the bounds of the exercise, we would expect that research independence flag to be persistent going forward. Yes, but I think our expectation is that if someone was research independent or had research independence in the last ref, they would have research independence in this ref, but they would need to be considered as part of the identifying research independence process as outlined in the new code of practice.
Thank you. I think we'll need to wrap up because we're at time, but I'm aware that there's lots of questions that people have submitted that we haven't been able to get to today, but we will get to them. The recording for today will be posted on our website, and we will also share the slides there as well. Was there anything else you wanted to say, Jonathan or Rebecca?
Just a huge thank you to everyone for attending. And thanks to everyone, I suppose, who's been involved in the development of the policies as well. We are sort of genuinely collaborative, and it's great to have opportunities to engage like this. So thank you very much.